Please turn in it to Acts chapter 21. This is where we will spend our time. Everybody in this room, I guarantee you, and you may not have thought about it this way, perhaps, I don't know. But if you took everybody in this room and you gave them a list of things that they would like most to have in life, I guarantee you that if you put certainty about your life on that list, that will be the one that wins the poll. Everybody wants to have that sense of certainty that we can look ahead, we can look to today, we can look at whatever we're planning, whatever things in our family that come and go. We want to have I want some kind of certainty in my life as I move through this world. And unfortunately in this world, for the most part, that's not really the way it goes most of the time. Uncertainty is that's the more general feature. But it's not what we want. Paul has come to a place in his life where I would say certainty has been completely eradicated from the natural events of what he goes through. And for some of us, that's pretty much where we live, in that sense of uncertainty. Did Paul hear wrongly from God that he came to Jerusalem? I would say no. But that all of those prophecies that he had heard for roughly 2 decades prior to coming to this point in Jerusalem, they had all been confirmed, because all of the bad things that were prophesied about what would happen to Paul in Jerusalem are coming to pass. How would that affect your sense of certainty? Let's look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 27. When the days of purification, the 7 days, were nearly over, some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple, and they stirred up the whole crowd and seized Paul, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us! This man who teaches all everywhere against our people, our law, and this temple. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and had assumed that Paul had brought Trophimus into the temple area, who was a Greek. The whole city was aroused. The people came running from all directions, and they seized Paul and dragged him from the temple. And immediately the gates to the temple were shut. While they were trying to kill Paul, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. The commander took at once some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. And the word there is actually centurions, which we'll get to in just a moment. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then the commander asked who Paul was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps of the barracks, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers, and the crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with Paul!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" the commander answered. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists into the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd, and when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me now, my defense." Okay, so this is just exactly like what happened in the Old Testament. When the Jews were subjugated by the Babylonians, in Isaiah prophesied 140 years before the events, and gave the name of the king, Cyrus the Persian, who would come and liberate the Jews. Paul is being liberated here in the same way by the Romans. He's being liberated from his own people who want to kill him because of what they think he has done. Paul is going about, from their point of view, if you're a strict Orthodox Jew, and again, we've got to have some empathy here because you've got 1,500 years of a singular teaching, and it looks like to them that Paul is defying that teaching. He is advocating ignorance of the laws. He's advocating he's devaluing the temple ceremonies, and he's devaluing all of the laws that have been given. So from their point of view, they are correct in their assessment of Paul. Have to realize that. We tend in our culture, I don't know where this comes from, I'm going to guess it comes from medieval Western Europe and the outlook that medieval Western Europe had on the Jewish people during that period of history. But we tend to look at the Jews here in this setting as bad. They are not bad. They are trying to be good Jewish people. They are trying their very best to obey the law. They look at Paul and they see him guilty, and rightly so, of two charges. One of the charges is he is teaching people that the validity of the temple is no more. That all of the ceremonies and things they're doing in the temple have historical remembrance value, but they have no value before God. They could go in there with gallons of sheep's and lambs and doves' blood, and it would make no difference to God whatsoever, because Jesus has come. The Messiah has come. He's also guilty of teaching them that obedience to the law, ceremonial, has no value. So what the Jews say about Paul here is not incorrect from their point of view. Now, in order for us to understand this, why did they get so mad? One of the charges was not true. They said that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, why would that make them so mad? Well, I think it would be good if you and all of us here in this room had an understanding of the temple arrangement, the structure of it. Because the temple, and I'm not making fun of it, it was kind of like an onion. There were layers of it that you went closer and closer and closer to the center. For instance, you had the porch, the outside porch, the steps up to the outside porch, and then there was what's called a colonnade. It was a covered porch all the way around. All right, this porch is where the church was meeting in the early part of the book of Acts. They met on Solomon's porch. There was a sign on the door. It says here the gates of the temple were shut. There was a sign on those doors all the way around the outside, and every place it said one thing. It said, "No Gentile past this point or subject to death." And the Jews were allowed by the Roman Empire to enforce that one. That was the one death penalty that the Jews were allowed to enforce. If a Gentile went through those doors, they could take their life, and it was okay with the Romans. They took it that seriously. All right, you got inside that chamber. There was another chamber and a wall around both sides of that. You're in a kind of a square hallway that went all the way around the temple. That hallway was called the Court of the Women. Jewish men and women could go in there. And then there was another sign on the doors that led to the next chamber going inward that said, the Court of the Sons of Israel. The women could not pass through that door. They were kept out. All right, so now all the Jewish men are in this chamber. There's another chamber. That chamber says, the Court of the Priests. So if you were not a member of the Aaronic priesthood by birth, it was handed down from father to son. If you were not a member of that priesthood, you could not go through that. You could go through that door, but if you weren't, you could not. So no Jewish person who was not a member of the priesthood could go any further into the temple, period. Priests went in there. Inside there was another door. That was the door to the sanctuary. So the priests went from this courtyard kind of place inside the temple into the sanctuary. Once they got in there, they performed a lot of the priestly functions, burning the incense and that sort of thing, offering the sacrifices. There's another barrier in there. It's the Holy of Holies. Inside the sanctuary was this 30-foot high, 7-foot wide curtain that hung, and inside there, one priest went in once a year on Yom Kippur. Yom meaning day, Kippur, atonement. One day a year, one priest who was chosen, everybody got chosen at some point, to go into that arena and make an offering for the people on Yom Kippur. And when they went in there, they tied a rope to their ankle and a bell on their cloak. Because if they died in the presence of God, nobody could go in there to get them out. So you had to drag them out by the rope. Now, think about what those barriers mean. Every one of them meant something. And for the Jew, it meant God is holy and He is other than we are. Look at all of the layers leading up to that place where God dwelt. Why do you think it was that the veil was torn from top to bottom when Jesus died? That meant that every barrier coming back this way was gone. That's why Paul is preaching against the temple in the way that he is. But the crowd doesn't know that. They assume that Paul has taken this Greek, this Gentile, into the temple. and that was subject to the penalty of death. So Paul, even though he is freed from it, he still respects the tradition. You see that from last week, because he paid to have it speaks to it in the beginning of the text. After the 7 days of purification for these 4 people whom Paul bought the sacrifices, paid for all of that, and paid to have their heads shaved because they had made a Nazirite vow, and Paul was asked to pay for it. He still respects the traditions. He's not one who's saying these traditions are stupid. He's simply saying that because the Messiah has come, the traditions hold no sway with God. But you and I have to realize these Jews do not know any of that. And they have read, I would encourage everybody in this room, if you don't do anything else with your life, read Deuteronomy 28 from start to finish. I mean, it is so important because it gives us the understanding of why the Jewish people at this time in history took all of this so seriously. Deuteronomy 28, the first 15 verses sound really good. This is what God will do if you obey. The last 54 of them sound really bad. These are the things that will happen to you if you do not obey. And these Jewish people have read that. They understand it well, and they're saying, we don't want these bad things to happen to us. We need to get rid of Paul. We need to get rid of this way. We need to get rid of all of this because it is defying what we see in Deuteronomy 28. That's why they come to that conclusion. But there's a piece missing, you see. Paul says it well. He says to the church at Corinth, the natural person does not receive the things of God's Spirit, because they are foolishness to the natural person. The natural person cannot know them because they are spiritually discerned. This entirety of the Jewish nation does not have the Spirit of God in them. And so they don't understand. They just don't understand what's going on. Well, Rome sends in the troops. And you might say to yourself, well, how is it in this day where there's no mass communication that Rome knew that this was going on? It's very easy. When Herod, this is so fascinating to me, when Herod built the temple, we call it Solomon's temple because that's where it is. But the temple's been rebuilt. This is the 3rd iteration. And Herod, in around 29 BC or so through up to the time of Jesus' birth, the temple was being rebuilt. Herod had done that. That's why the Jews kind of liked Herod, because he had rebuilt their temple. But in order to get it built, he had to make a deal. And the deal was with the Roman Empire, and it said, you will also put a barracks next door to the temple. It was called Antonia's Castle. And the steps came right down onto Solomon's porch. It is said by most of the historians who look at this that usually on any of the feast days within Judaism, there would be about 1,000 troops in that castle. Because they knew, and again, this is not to disparage the Jewish people, they took what they believed very seriously, and if there was an infraction, they went into an uproar, just like here. And so Antonia's castle was filled. The scripture says, and I don't know why the NIV translates it that way, the word is centurion. And it says centurions, which means you got at least 2. A centurion was over 100 troops. F.F. Bruce, the great biblical scholar, says there were at least 2, there were probably many more. So you had upward of 1,000 troops waiting for trouble because they expected it. Well, so they come right down the steps as soon as there's this riot, and they show up. And believe me, Rome is like the IRS. If you owe the IRS $5,000, they'll spend $10 million to get it from you. They don't care. Overkill means nothing to them. It meant nothing to the Romans. The Romans would send 1,000 troops down there just to handle Paul, little old Paul, and what was going on. It's so serious that they finally have to carry Paul through the mob. And then Paul speaks to this commander. This commander is a famous person in Roman history. His name is Claudius Lysias. And he's known outside of these texts. Claudius Lysias hears Paul speak in cultured Greek. That's why Claudius Lysias says, do you speak Greek? This little Jewish man? Paul speaks to him not in just average Greek, but cultured Greek. And so Claudius Lysias looks at the mob. He knows that only a few years before this, about 5 years before this, in 54 AD, there was an Egyptian who led 4,000 people as a new Messiah out into the Mount of Olives, and he said, the walls of the temple will fall down at my command. The Romans took a very dim view of anything that looked like insurrection. They arrested all 4,000 of the followers. The Egyptian got away. So the commander thinks that's who Paul is. He looks at that mob, he says, this has got to be the guy. But then Paul gives him his history and says no. When he hears him address him, and by the way, that address that Paul gives him in that cultured Greek, an Egyptian from Alexandria, which was the most educated culture on the planet at the time, would have spoken cultured Greek. So this is why the commander makes this connection. But he understands after Paul gives his credentials that Paul is not this thug. And then Paul addresses the crowd in Aramaic, the language of the Jewish nation that was spoken at the time. Paul is at least trilingual at this time in history. And when he does, the crowd grows silent. Now, he's addressing them from the steps that connected Antonius Castle with the temple. So what is Paul doing here at this moment? Everything in Paul's life looks chaotic and uncertain. Everything. There is nothing in Paul's life at this moment that looks like God is orchestrating some magnificent plan. You know, we've got this glorified hindsight of 2,000 years to look back. We've read some of this stuff. Oh yes, God is working. We all know that. They didn't know that then. This is a huge, they could have killed Paul easily on those temple steps on the charge of bringing a Greek into the temple, and the Romans would have let them kill him because they took that charge seriously. But Paul speaks to the commander, and Paul then asks to address the crowd, and the crowd falls silent. This is just one of those times wherein you're seeing God work and orchestrate things, and the people who are being orchestrated have no idea of the orchestration. Paul isn't certain when he starts to address that crowd that they're even going to listen to him. They just wanted to kill him a few minutes before. Why should they pay any attention to Paul? It is because now God is working. God has been orchestrating this moment. That is exactly what our lives look like. Every minute of every day that you and I walk in this world, God is orchestrating moments for us to be salt and light in this world. And I'll tell you, for Rip, I probably miss 90% of them just because I'm just too dense and dull to see the moment that's in front of me. But He is doing that for everybody who calls the name of Jesus. Each one of us have these divine appointments in which we are given these opportunities to live for Jesus in a way that may have implications that go way down into history that none of us have any idea about. Paul didn't have any idea that this moment for him was going to be a moment that would play into the history. Here we sit now, 1,900 years and change later, and we are reading of Paul in this moment, and it is speaking to us. Right? Paul's testimony is still happening. Here we are today. It's telling us something. But it looks, from Paul's standpoint, can you imagine being one? I would hate to be Trophimus. I mean, Trophimus is one of the guys that came with Paul, traveling back to bring that offering to the Jews in Jerusalem in the Jewish church. Trophimus is probably scared to death, and there were other Greeks with Paul as well. And they're thinking, what are they going to do to us? Look what they're doing to Paul. It just looks like utter chaos, but you see God using Paul in ways in this moment that would be unimaginable for Paul. I'm going to say the last 25 years of Paul's life have been pretty unimaginable for Paul. And they're going to get more unimaginable as we go through the book of Acts. But stop for a moment and think about it from Paul's perspective. What's he doing in Jerusalem? He just wants to be there for Pentecost. That's all. It would be like if you and I said, I got to get to Staples before they close at 8 o'clock. And God brings to you and me some kind of divine appointment in that moment. An ordinary, mundane, nothing moment in Paul's life, an ordinary, mundane, nothing moment in our lives, and God brings us to something wherein He's going to use us in a way that if we weren't available, we would not be used. And most of those get past us, don't we? Think about it from the standpoint of a family. I do. I mean, this is one of the, as Lauren was saying to us about the thoughts that are in her head, I'm thinking about the thoughts that are in my head. And I'm thinking about the moments within my own family, and I know of them. I can think of them where I know that I was given an opportunity and I failed to live it. God gave me something to do, something to say, some way to behave, some way to act, and I failed. Why? I was tired, or I was busy, or I was just occupied with something that I wanted to do, and I missed it. I missed it. Our lives are filled with those things. They are filled. And you and I are sitting here today and we're thinking to ourselves, perhaps, maybe we're not thinking about anything, but maybe we are. I like the idea of certainty. I like the idea of having that knowledge of where I'm going in my life. Where is God taking me? I want to have that sense of certainty. Do you think Paul had any sense of certainty in this moment at all? Not with the circumstances. But I'll tell you this, he had one sense of certainty, and that's the same certainty available to all of us. And that's the certainty that God is with us. He's with us. He's going to walk us through it. So when we go to the doctor and we get the diagnosis, it's uncertain what's going to happen, right? It's uncertain when you're driving to the doctor and you say, what's he going to tell me? What's she going to tell me? But the diagnosis comes, there is a certainty that comes along with it, and that is God's going to walk with us through it, whatever it is. We're raising a young son, and you probably, well, I know you guys know that. You and Danielle know that there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with these little guys. I mean, their lives are just filled with uncertainties. Not from their point of view, but from ours. And I'm looking at my own son, and my head is filled with uncertainties. But there's one thing that's certain. I've prayed for him. I've prayed for my son. I've prayed for some of you all. Some of you all have prayed for me. There is something certain in who God is and what He intends for us that we can just settle there, even when everything around us looks completely uncertain. If you want to see uncertainty, turn on the news and watch 15 minutes of the news, and you will think to yourself, the world has gone crazy and there's nothing certain in this world. And you're right. There is nothing certain in this world. God brings us that sense of certainty in Him alone. There is no place of certainty other than that. Who can sit in this room and say, I have certainty about the next 5 minutes of my life? And if we say that, we're deluded, because we don't. But God is the place where the certainty is. Our mindset should be to walk in this world, and it's an adventure. It's not a bad thing. It's not something we've got to grit our teeth and make ourselves do it. It's an adventure to walk in this world with the mindset of, what is the significance of this moment in my life? What would God use me to do? Paul is walking like that, and he doesn't have a clue what's going to happen to him. He gives us the same gift. I don't know wherever